Dana White has famously said that fighting is in our DNA and that everyone around the world gets it, right? So does that actually mean that every single country in the world can become an MMA superpower? In this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take a look at a blueprint that any country could follow to not just have a presence in the UFC, but actually become a global superpower. Today, the long-standing superpowers in MMA are countries like the US, Brazil, Russia, England. You get the picture. But what if in about 10 years' time, if the landscape of MMA looked totally different and a bunch of countries that we don't particularly associate as being MMA superpowers have flooded the gates of the UFC and totally changed the sport forever? Hey guys, my name is Chris. I'm the owner of MMA Ecosystem. If you like this video, definitely please subscribe to the channel, but let's get into the actual video. Now we know that whenever Dana White is asked about what countries he wants to expand to next, he always gives this really vague answer of all of them. I want to go everywhere. And I do think that the UFC has it in their plans to expand literally everywhere around the world. Right now they're really pushing hard towards China, they're pushing hard towards the Middle East. They would love for Mexico to continue its run after crowning 3 champions from that country this year. But in this video I'm going to mostly focus on the Asian countries. A lot of these countries don't really even have a presence in MMA anywhere around the world, nonetheless the UFC. And of course lots of countries have had little starts and stops from time to time. A fighter that will begin to do well, be signed by one championship or Bellator, have a nice little run. But I'm talking more from a 30,000 foot level, looking at the country as a whole, their record of consistency, things like that. So before we head into how a country can take steps towards being an MMA superpower, I want to give you sort of what does the end goal look like? What is the vision of a completely healthy MMA ecosystem, if you will? What does that look like in any given country? Well, it looks like a couple things. First of all, it looks like having several homegrown gyms with really excellent coaching that provide fighters a path to become elite, all while staying in-house, where they can go from the amateur level all the way up to elite pro level. It means having fighters in the top 10 or 15 in the UFC, and if possible, at least one fighter with a really strong fan base. There needs to be a robust local circuit where fighters can fight other really good competition all without having to leave their own country, where there's belts that can be won, really good rivalries that can take place. Okay, so there needs to be preferably a couple really strong promotions within the same country, or at least opportunities for fighters to fight at a really high level all within their own country. Okay, and on the upper end of things, there needs to be broadcast deals, either through an app or through linear TV, that makes watching MMA or the UFC really easy to the most possible people. Ideally, these broadcasting deals are going to have programming in their local language, featuring people that natively speak their local language, and also having content that is specifically curated for that particular fan base. Okay, and it really helps when there are events from high-level promotions like the UFC that are coming and taking place in that country. All of these things are examples of a really healthy environment for MMA in a particular country. Now, I need to throw out a couple disclaimers because, of course, not every single country is going to follow this model that I'm putting out. There's a lot of exceptions out there. Some countries are going to be completely doing their own thing. Poland, for example, is kind of run by the KSW promotion. They're more popular than the UFC there, and for a lot of Polish fighters, their goal is to be in KSW instead of the UFC. This is sort of an exception, right, within the global MMA landscape. I also acknowledge that the UFC isn't the only player for fighters, and that one championship has been doing things with Asian athletes for a long time, giving them opportunities to fight in bigger promotions. I'm kind of looking at this from like the highest level possible, right? And then to even further throw things through a loop, there's a lot of countries out there that have sort of experienced this whole life cycle of MMA, and then they're almost coming back around the picture. Thinking about countries like Brazil, who's had some really great eras in their MMA development, or Japan, where MMA is essentially from, and they had pride and sort of the luster of that age. And then things kind of died off in the late 2000s, early 2010s in Japan. And we're probably seeing a revival of MMA in Japan, but it's taking a long time to rebuild. So not every country is like perfectly fitting on this level right now. Also, I'm gonna walk you through a couple different phases, and a lot of these phases overlap for sure. Sometimes you may even have characteristics of phase 2 and phase 4 at the same time. Again, think about this as loosely as you can as we go through. All right, let's get into it. So before you can talk about the development of MMA in a country, you have to talk about what are the martial arts background of that country. Do they have a really strong wrestling base? Is it Sanda for China? Different kinds of martial arts are going to play into the strengths and weaknesses and also the training styles of a particular country. So that's important to remember. But the first level of MMA development in any country is building a good foundation. A foundation, what I consider, is two main things. It's good gyms and good promotions. With good gyms, again, you want to have gyms that are adequately training fighters to fight at an elite level. In terms of starting things off, right, you just need a couple fighters that can provide a place for athletes to train, for strength and conditioning, probably going to be based around the primary martial arts background in that country, whether that's Sanda or Muay Thai or wrestling. So you have to have good gyms. And then after you have good gyms, you have to have good promotions in a country. Places for fighters to test themselves. These are gonna happen at really low levels, probably not gonna pay fighters that much or at all at the beginning. But as things grow, fighters need to be able to make money, at least to cover their training expenses, hopefully even a little bit more, so that they can, over time, give more and more time to their MMA training, take things more and more seriously. As a promotion at a local level develops, ideally they're gonna have some amateur fights, some pro fights. They need to have a good sanctioning body in place. A good sanctioning body is kind of like the absolute bedrock for MMA to take off in any country. Is a reputable sanctioning body that's going to adhere to rules and apply them, conduct themselves in a professional manner. So it's not necessary that promotions are able to pay fighters lots of money, attract huge crowds at first. They mainly just need to get fighters experience so they can get things off of the ground. But in time, they do want to create more and more competitive matchups. Eventually, they'll want to pull other fighters from neighboring areas if they are not able to fill out their fight cards with fighters from local gyms. If they're in India, for example, they may want to pull from Nepal or Pakistan. Another thing that you'll probably see really often is foreigners that live in that country who are trained in MMA fighting on those fight cards. You saw that a lot with China for a long time. You still see that a lot with China. You see that even in India a little bit. You'll see kind of a hodgepodge mix of fighters on these cards. Local fighters versus fighters from nearby regions to foreigners training in the area. And I can't stress enough how important it is for local promotions to conduct themselves in a professional manner, to fulfill the promises that they make for fighters, to not take advantage of fighters, and to provide a positive space for fighters to fight. So many promotions are taking advantage of fighters, not able to pay fighters after the fights, and conducting themselves in very unprofessional ways. And this actively hurts the development of MMA. So what's next? Okay, so the next stage of development for fighters is what I call the exodus stage. Why I call it the exodus stage is because at that point, fighters have been training and competing in their own countries, their hometowns for a long time, and now they're starting to break out of that. They're starting to want to test themselves in different areas, whether that's traveling to different parts of the country or hopefully even outside of their country. A couple of these fighters might be signed by sort of mid-level international promotions like UAE Warriors or Brave to get a shot in those kind of promotions. Fighters may also be leaving their countries to go train at other gyms, to train at bigger, more well-known gyms in their larger regions. So think about fighters leaving China to go train in Thailand, things like that. This is the exodus stage. This is kind of like where they're starting to leave their home area and test the waters in other places. They're rounding out their skills, the gaps that their local upbringing couldn't give them, whether that was wrestling or strength and conditioning. So you're seeing a little bit of a testing as they move out into different areas. Okay, and usually about the time this happens is when a fighter is building their own fan base. As they're collecting belts in their own country and traveling outside of their country, their stories are being told by promoters. They're becoming more well known in their home countries because everyone in India loves to see an Indian fighter with a belt, knocking people out, going to other countries. Everyone loves to see someone that looks like them succeed at sports, especially on a high level. So about this time, you'll start to see fighters start to build their own little fan bases. Okay, so this is kind of the point where things start to turn towards a little bit more of an elite level. You'll start to see more and more fighters signed by big promotions like the UFC, kind of at the tail end of this exodus phase. This makes way to what I would call the troubleshooting phase. Now, the troubleshooting phase is probably the longest and most frustrating phase out of all of them. It's exciting for fans because they're finally starting to see their fighters competing at a high level in the UFC, Bellator, One Championship. But the problem is that they're not going to be successful for a long time. The UFC is going to be wanting to sort of choose some test fighters to try and build their exposure in different countries. So they're going to sign fighters from different countries and sort of see how do they do. They're going to test the waters a little bit, but most likely these fighters are not going to be successful for a long time. At least they may have some wins here and there, but overall there's going to be a lot of disappointment for fans as sort of the ceiling for what's possible of these countries gets hit over and over and over. And it's at this time that these fighters have to go through a troubleshooting phase. They have to go back to the drawing board over and over and over again. They may have to change coaches or change camps, move across the world. They need to test themselves against different kinds of fighters, against Dagestanis and Americans and Muay Thai fighters, everything in between. So this is a long and very frustrating stage. A lot of fans get discouraged in this phase, but it's entirely necessary if they want to ever reach the elite level. This phase can often last many years. Of course, some markets never make their way out of it. It's not a guarantee that fighters will make it to the elite level. It could even take 10, 15 years. Eventually, if they keep leaning into it, if they keep asking the questions, they keep having their ear on the pulse of MMA, trying to make those adjustments, I think eventually they will break through. So that leads me to the fourth stage, and that is peak number one, which is the elite level. Finally, you're gonna start getting some athletes that are making it to the elite level. If they're in the UFC, they're gonna start getting numbers by their name. Typically, hopefully, if you're reaching this level, you've got a couple fighters that are ranked. You may even get a title shot here and there. If you're really lucky, you get a champion out of it. But even just making it to the ranked of the UFC is a big win in and of itself. So this is, of course, when you start to see a lot of big broadcast deals signed. You're gonna see the fan base opening up a lot, potentially events in those countries. So this is really the phase that the UFC wants to get to for that fan base to really bloom. But this is not the last stage of MMA development for a country. There's a step further that even if you have a champion, you're not quite in the place where you're going to set yourself up for the long run. Of course, that's phase number 5, the last phase, and that's investment back into the foundation. The foundation that launched these athletes into the elite level is never going to be perfect. It's never going to perfectly give fighters what they need to succeed at the highest level. If they're coming from a Muay Thai background, they're gonna have some really good striking skills, but even in MMA striking, there's gonna be some deficiencies. There's a lot of differences of how a Muay Thai fighter fights and how often they fight and how they train with how an MMA fighter would fight and train at an elite level. So at that time, a fighter that has enjoyed a lot of success in the elite level, once they start to get a little older, that it's time for them to retire, they can go back to their home countries and they can invest back into the foundation. A lot of them, you'll see them start their own gyms in the country. You may even see them become coaches at existing gyms or even start their own promotion. So for example, we're seeing Korea hit this stage right now. Korea hit the elite stage a little while ago, a couple years ago. They had Korean Zombie as an elite fighter, Kim Dong-hyun. They had a number of other Korean fighters fight in main events of UFC events. And now what you're seeing is a lot of these Korean fighters, as they're getting older, are going back to their home country. They're starting their own gyms like Korean Zombie MMA, like Stun Gun MMA. And then you've got Yang Dong-yi is the promoter of Double G FC. So you're gonna see a lot of really professional experience injected back into the foundation, to where the foundation that is preparing young fighters for the future is gonna be a really solid professional elite foundation. Then you're just gonna start to see young 18, 19, 20-year-old fighters who are undefeated and ready for the UFC at a really young age, and then the market is off to the races. That's sort of like a quick overview of how a country can go from the beginning stages, or even having no MMA exposure at all, to becoming a global superpower. And I kind of touched on some of the things that the promoter tries to do, or the UFC tries to do along the way, like getting TV deals, deals, having local events, specialized, localized programming, being able to connect the fans with some of their stars. These are all really important things that a promoter can do. So what I did is I just kind of chose a couple Asian countries and plotted them out on this map. You can kind of see, like, you've got countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, not even really on the map right now. If you look up Bengali or Cambodian fighters at Tapology, not many fighters coming up, at least not with winning records. Some of the fighters that do have winning records are older or retired, so not really much going on in that country at all. There might be a couple fighters training abroad at different places, and they may even have some prospects that are in the really early phases, but at least at an observable place for people like me, it's hard to see that there's really a lot going on in that country. And then you can see Nepal is just now in this foundation step. They have a new sanctioning body, they've got a couple gyms there. Even this month, they're gonna be having an event starring probably the best Nepali fighter to date. Rabindra John can be fighting in Nepal Warrior Championship. So that is great. They're sort of building things from the ground up. Then if you go further up into the Exodus stage, into sort of the troubleshooting stage, a lot of times these phases bleed together a little bit. But I've got India and Indonesia on there. Probably India have them a little bit farther ahead. With Indonesia, they've got a pretty good local promotion called One Pride MMA that promotes their fighters really well, that has a huge fan base. These events are just like really lively and fun events. One Pride does some of the best job of any promotion of the world of helping fans to get to know their fighters. On the contrast, India might have a slightly better quality of fighters, and they've also got a really high quality promotion like Matrix Fight Night that is treating fighters with a lot of professionalism, paying them really, really well, at least, especially for the area, and their main focus is developing MMA as a whole. So these countries are well on their way, and we'll see how these countries develop, especially as Road to UFC continues. I know that the TV deal that the UFC has in India with Sony expires at the end of 2023, so they may be wanting to negotiate a new, better deal in India. Definitely be watching for that. And then further up the chain, you have China, which is pretty much in the elite level. They've got a champion right now. They've got fighters like Song Yadong, Li Jingliang, and Yan Xiaonan are all top fighters that have been very successful in the UFC. So they're pretty much in that elite level. The only thing that's missing is just the quantity. They're really still underrepresented compared to their size as the second most populated country in the world, right behind India. So right now what the UFC is doing is they're just trying to get more quantity in there. With China, of course, the UFC made the Shanghai PI, which helps to add some extra speed to all of this development, especially with the coaching, strength and conditioning, dieting, all of those things. It's been a great resource for fighters and has sped along their development. And then of course at the top there, in the second peak, you have Korea, which, as I mentioned, is starting to reinvest back into their foundation and produce a lot of young, incredible talent. But what I want to do right now is actually zoom in on China, because if you don't believe me about this process, let's just look at how China has progressed through these different phases, okay? So before the year 2005, there really wasn't anything going on in China. The Art of War promotion started in China in 2005, had a lot of foreigner fighters, like I said, very low-level fights, and then somewhere along the lines, gyms like China Top Team started, a couple of your other staples like Shindu Fight Club, Longyuan MMA, some of your current staples for China. And then kind of in that same time, you had promotions like RUFF, Legend FC started. So kind of late 2000s, early 2010s was kind of the exodus phase for China. You started to see some fighters fighting outside of China. And of course, Zhang Tiechun was signed to the WC in 2010. The first Chinese fighter to fight with the UFC. That was a monumental moment for China in the UFC. It was about that same time in 2010 that the UFC signed a broadcast deal with Sohu. Sohu is a sort of blogging and video site with China. Not necessarily the most cutting edge of cool, but it was just a way for them to get their foot in the door with China. So they're able to do that. Although Zhang Tiechun Chun would go 1-3 with the promotion, he still was sort of a banner carrier. He is still a prominent coach within China at China Top Team, and also was picked to be a coach on the Ultimate Fighter China. So I would say Ultimate Fighter China was the beginning of the troubleshooting stage for Chinese MMA. It wasn't all that successful in terms of producing high-level talent for the UFC. It was a good gauge just to see where fighters were at the moment. None of these fighters really did that well in the UFC. Ning Guangyo and Zhang Lipeng, who both won the Ultimate Fighter China, had mixed results in the UFC and were ultimately cut after a couple straight losses. So those are the best fighters that came out of that show. Ning Guangyo has since gone back to start his own gym in China, and Zhang Lipeng went on a long win streak locally in China and now is signed by one championship. So the troubleshooting stage for China, which in some ways might still be going on, sort of tailing off here. I would say this was really from Ultimate Fighter China all the way up, definitely to the UFC Shanghai event. Before the UFC Shanghai event, fighters from China in the UFC, before that UFC Shanghai event, were 13-18 altogether in the UFC. So losing record, most of those fights were pretty low-level fights, and most of those wins were from Li Jingliang, really the first fighter to be successful in the UFC from China. And then of course in 2016, UFC upped their broadcast deal from Sohu.com to PPTV, which is a leading sports app in China. That was a pretty big deal, worth about 50 million. At that point, the UFC had a couple events in Macau and in Singapore that at least gave the UFC the opportunity to create some localized content for China, have things in their own time zone. Of course, this led up to the UFC Shanghai event in November of 2017. This was an incredibly successful event. You saw fighters debut at this event like Wu Yanan, Yan Xiaonan, Song Yadong. Of course, Li Jingliang fought and won by knockout in the co-main event. An incredible night for the Chinese fighters. Ultimately, they went 5-3. But I gotta tell you guys, I even remember watching this event and just having almost like a feeling of dread before the event that all of the Chinese fighters might lose, except for Li Jingliang. At that point, I had felt like Chinese MMA was a little bit of a laughing stock, and people felt like they didn't belong in the UFC. For this event in Shanghai, it was a little bit risky, but fortunately they were able to get some really good fighters like Song and Yan, and they look great on this card. So that kind of turned a corner in the troubleshooting phase. Of course, that phase has continued in a lot of ways since then. Aside from some of the elite fighters, other fighters have struggled to really put together long win streaks. Of course, you had Contender Series in 2011, where 6 fighters were pegged to compete in Dana White's Contender Series from China, and only one of them, Mahashate, won his fight and a UFC contract. So that was a hard loss, such as normal in the troubleshooting phase, right? And then of course the UFC doubled down on their commitment to China by going to Beijing in 2018. This is where Zhang Weili and Sumu Darji made their UFC debuts. And also the UFC kind of got really lucky with Zhang Weili, right? They had this ready-made UFC star that had a ridiculous amount of talent, a lot of things figured out, and was ready for a title shot after being in the UFC for less than a year. She main evented the 3rd trip from the UFC to China, UFC Shenzhen in 2019, and things could not have gone better for her and the UFC. She knocks out Jessica Andrade and becomes the first Chinese champion, probably before the rest of the market is ready. This opened up China to the UFC. They struck a massive deal with Migu, another really popular app, and the deal was worth around 8 figures. Massively more than their last deal with PPTV. They also opened the UFC PI in Shanghai, which was a big win for them. So things were really looking up at this time. They're moving into more of the elite stage. A lot of things are worked out in troubleshooting. Of course, part of that troubleshooting process is that many of these fighters have gone to other countries to train. You've got Song and Yan training at Team Alpha Male. You've got Li Jingliang, Mahashate, Shailan all training at Killcliff FC. You've got Zhang Weili training at Bangtao, right? So you've got a lot of these fighters leaving China, going to get the best training available to them around the world. Eventually that training will be reinvested back into the Chinese foundation. But for now, in this troubleshooting and elite stage, they're training abroad. So what do I expect going forward? I expect that especially countries like India and Indonesia, I think that they're on the perfect track forward, and they're absolutely going to become MMA superpowers in 5, 6, 7 years. The next couple years could be a little bit frustrating for fans, as certain fighters that have some promise are chosen to be in the UFC or road to UFC and will probably have some mixed success. In the meantime, the UFC is going to sign bigger and bigger broadcast deals within these countries. They're going to potentially even host an event in these places. Wouldn't even surprise me if UFC Jakarta or UFC Mumbai happened earlier than we think, just to try and pump some energy into those localized markets. Could we see a UFC PI in these countries? Now, not every country is going to get their own UFC PI, but it wouldn't surprise me if especially India gets one. It wouldn't surprise me if Singapore got a UFC PI, and probably somewhere in the Middle East as well. But in the meantime, a lot of these other countries that are a little bit further back in their development, just keep an eye on them. Look to see what fighters are coming up. You know, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just Google search MMA fighters from X country, and a list from Tapology will come up, and you can kind of look through and see who's coming up, what are fighters' records, where are they competing, or is there anyone active right now? So that's what I would recommend if you're wanting to kind of follow the development of a country. Of course, the best way to follow any country in Asia's development is by following this channel, MMA Ecosystem, here on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. That's what I've devoted my whole entire job to, is to follow the growth of MMA through Asia and help everyone around the world to connect to fighters and their stories. So keep it locked here, subscribe to the channel, appreciate all of your support. We'll see you next time.